Hey there, boys and girls. Hope you're all fat and happy this week, enjoying this glorious gospel. One of the questions we often get is, how do you deal with the book of James? Now, this is kind of a big question, all right, but there are a lot of passages in the book of James that people rightly say they sound non-gracious. Now, I can't go through the entire book of James in 10 minutes, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and I want to put it into perspective. Okay, so let's back up a minute. If you read the book of James backwards, you are going to get really screwed up. Okay, salvation is not about faith plus works. The Apostle Paul makes this overabundantly clear in his letters. The truth we see in James is that if we have faith, then of course it will spill forth in good works as a fruit. Of course there is a lifestyle change. Of course you begin to be the good boy that you really are. But works are not the surcharge to salvation. There's a difference in works for righteousness and works of righteousness. Because you are righteous, therefore you do good stuff, but you're not buying your righteousness. You don't read James in addition to Paul. Instead, read James through the lens of Pauline grace. More than any other New Testament writer, we have to pay attention to the Apostle Paul. Romans 2:16 in the Ben Campbell Johnson translation, Paul says that God will judge everyone through Jesus Christ based on my interpretation of the good news. Now that's pretty bold for a human being to say. Paul is saying God's going to judge everybody based on how I read the books. So if Paul's making such a crazy claim, we should maybe pay a little bit of attention to Paul. Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. Luke traveled with Paul, interned with Paul before he wrote the book of Luke. Mark traveled with Paul, interned with Paul before he wrote the book of Mark. Luke traveled and interned with Paul before he wrote the book of Acts. Acts is all about the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Paul slapped down Peter in front of everybody at one point. Peter affirmed the inspiration of Paul's letters, and men sent from James even persecuted Paul. Maybe, just maybe, old Paulie boy was packing something that the other kids were not. Paul's letters are not an addendum added on after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Any theologian worth his salt and paper clips can tell you that Paul's letters were written decades and decades before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As a matter of fact, they are giving historical evidence, the four Gospels are, of the Lord's earthly ministry in order to back up this revelation of grace that Paul was vehemently preaching, the revelation of the finished work of the cross. Now look, if you are just stuck in the red letters of Jesus before the cross, you are only going to see him preaching law on steroids. I mean, even tougher than Moses. Moses said not to commit adultery, but Jesus says you just glance at some porn, you've already done it. Moses said not to kill anybody. Jesus says you just flip them off in traffic, you've already done it. Jesus took the law to a whole nother level in order to frustrate you so that you would give up and throw yourself into the arms of the Savior. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not the gospel. You can call them the gospels, that's fine. But the gospel is the revelation of what Jesus accomplished single-handedly on the tree. A great exchange took place and is most clearly articulated through the letters of the Apostle Paul. Now to say that, some people are going to think I'm elevating Paul in a way that a good Catholic would elevate the Virgin Mary. If you think I am elevating Paul's letters above the words of Jesus, well, maybe you didn't realize that Paul's letters are the words of Jesus, this side of the cross. Look, Martin Luther did not even believe that James belongs in the Bible. I do believe James belongs in the Bible, but it is more of a transition book into the New Covenant. I mean, on the surface, what James is, it is a sermon written to Jews in Jerusalem. It is a transitional book for people moving out of a Judaic mindset and into a Christian one. Once you become established in the grace of the cross, you realize that James is speaking in part, still in some shadows that are clarified by the full announcement of the gospel. He starts out with some basic moral instruction on faith, perseverance, temptation, loose speech, favoritism, moral issues. He goes on to say that breaking any point of the law makes you an all-out lawbreaker. But this is true for all of us under the law. Although it's true, James does not clearly go on to articulate that Christ single-handedly completed the law and our freedom is now in the spirit of life under grace. We now live upright, moral lives based on New Testament morality from the inside out, not just externally following the letter that kills. He goes on into this whole faith and works bit, followed by more moral teaching about how we should speak peaceable, live moral lives. He spends a lot of time about taming your tongue. I mean, it's okay to tell a joke every now and then, but don't be a potty mouth on social media all the time. Just basic good advice, okay? Don't covet. Check your motives. Be humble. Don't laugh and rejoice over sin and worldliness. Don't judge people. Don't live only for this world. Do good. Don't complain. Don't be wishy-washy. Acknowledge when you do wrong. That is James in a nutshell. It is a great tract on morality. You should read it. You should do it. And that's it. Left by itself, you have no clue what Jesus has accomplished on your behalf. So read James, live James, meditate on James. But without the full revelation of who you are in Jesus, clearly articulated by Paul, then James itself will only condemn you. James is perfect for its purpose. Just like his brother Jesus, he's showing his fellow Jews that their external observance of the law is invalidated when they've already broken that law internally in their hearts. But there he stops short with no resolution. And we see the fruit of having James only as your teacher in his disciples who came to Antioch judging their Gentile brothers for eating bacon and not hacking off their foreskins. James is a great articulation on the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but Jesus is the tree of life. You are fully forgiven, and now you are fully free to be the holy person you are. Don't write James off, take him seriously, but put him in his proper perspective in the new covenant. Now, check this out.
We just planned a last-minute tour across